Давайте еще раз предупрежу. Доклад Джонатана, который должен состояться сегодня по программе, его не будет. Джонатана нет, доклада тоже нет. У нас сейчас доклад Ольги Финкель, который должен был, наоборот, быть вчерашней секции по гэмблингу. Давайте начинать.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry I'm in the wrong place and at the wrong time, but now we are all here, so let's go through this. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the regulation of online gambling in Europe. You will see that the social game space and the gambling space are quite different markets, as you know very well, of course, and the regulatory aspects that regulate different businesses also differ. However, we will also see that they coming close to each other, and this is why it's always good for the developers of non-gambling games to have an idea at least what's happening in the regulation of the gambling space, to make sure that if they decide to jump into the different realm, they're prepared. Well, if we see different markets, the social gaming markets or non-games of chance markets and games of chance markets, you will see that they are quite different. And they are different according to many different parameters. Over here, we're just discussing some of them. If you look at the games of chance, then obviously chance is the major element that generally determines the outcome of the game. We have to say that it doesn't need to be 100% chance, and in many countries it can be just partially on chance, but chance plays a big element over here. On the other hand, for casual games, for social games, it's definitely not chance, or at least not predominantly chance, and it's a skill, either of the gamer himself or herself, or of the other participants of the game. The genre of the games are quite different. Actually, for the games of chance, it's a very narrow space. It's just table games like slot machines or roulette or blackjack. There is, of course, a variety of slot games, but generally this is pretty much it, while everything else, and the sky is the limit for the non-games of chance space. With regard to the payment for the game, that's also different for two markets. In the casual games, there can be no payment at all, or sometimes when you have freemium, there can be partially free entrance to the game, and then you pay for virtual goods, or you pay by subscription, or you don't pay at all. While quite differently for games of chance, it's absolutely necessary that there is a stake. In fact, if there is no stake, generally it will not be part of the gambling at all. The motivation is very important and is different as well, but even more important is the outcome of the game. For the game of chance, the most important part that there is a prize, and this is very often is the money, but it can also be money equivalent that you can turn into money if you want to. While for the casual games, there is definitely a different outcome of the game. It is the achievements, it is the medals, it is to show to your friends that you are better, or anything else, or get more virtual goods, but generally it's not the money. And for casual games, there is very often use of social networks, like Facebook's, Contacti, and others, while there is no, generally speaking, until very recently, use of social networks for the games of chance. And so, because the markets are so different, then obviously the regulatory aspects for two different markets are different as well. If for games of chance, there is generally very strong regulatory aspects in many countries of the world, in Europe in particular, and there is no such regulations for casual games. Even though that we say that there is no regulation for casual games, it doesn't mean that it's Wild West, of course. There are different laws that do apply for casual games, for social games, even though we don't call them regulation. And this is so because we have so-called horizontal legislation, which applies to different industries. No matter what you sell online, whether it's games or shoes or pillowcases or whatever else, there are certain laws that would apply. Here on this slide, you will see 4 different types of legislation that is generally applicable for all online business, online commerce, and in particularly for selling games online. First of all, there are rules for electronic commerce, and basically the important part that the terms and conditions that you have on the website have juridical value. When your players sign I agree to your terms and conditions, generally that will be a recognized contract and you will be able to enforce it. The laws also require you to provide certain information to the players about your goods, about your services, about how to order them, how to pay, and so on and so forth. The laws applicable for consumer protection even develop this aspect further. And you need to provide not only information about your goods and services and about the supplier, but also about different processes. You have to put it in a form that a normal person will understand, and all the information should be online. Very often also, this kind of legislation allows players, users, consumers to withdraw from the contract within a particular period of time. Generally, it's 14 days. However, there is an exception for that, and if in the meantime the consumer already started using your services, therefore playing the game, then obviously there will not be right of withdrawal in this case. Another important area of legislation is the personal data protection. Personal data protection means that you cannot actually collect all the information from your players. Of course, if the player gives you consent, then you can collect whatever you want and use it for whatever you want, as long as there is consent. But very often, if you don't obtain consent from the player, then the laws protect the player's personal data and do not allow you to collect all the information you like. Very often, you cannot even do profiling, for example, which is very important to push your game. So the advice here is very often to put in your terms and conditions everything you want, so you can collect as much information from the player that you want and use it for the widest possible reasons. And the last one I would like to discuss is the unfair terms of contracts. There are also European directives that prohibit certain particular terms. So you can put whatever you want in your terms and conditions, but if it is an unfair term, recognized as an unfair term, it will simply not have a legal value, and therefore you will not be able to apply it at all. Even though the markets are very different, we'll see that there is a convergence, or at least moving together from both sides, both from the casual game sides and from the games of chance sides. If we look first from the convergence from the casual game side to the games of chance, then you will see that obviously, first of all, what comes to mind is monetization of the client base. I mean, it's great to have a free for-play game, but every business wants to make some profit, and therefore monetization is extremely important here. So this is one of the drivers that moves casual games closer somewhat to the games of chance market. Then there is an extension of the offering from the operators who are generally and traditionally in the casual game space. Apart from monetization, very often you will see that there are certain winnings offered to the players in recent games, and it doesn't need to be just money. It can be a virtual good that can be converted into money, and we'll see later on why this part is important. And the extension of the market, obviously, to extend the market base. In a similar way, from the games of chance, there is a movement to embrace casual games and to embrace social networks. And even from the demographics point of view of the players, it's quite common knowledge these days that the player games for social games or casual games are generally younger, and therefore the games of chance operator try to increase the market base and want to introduce different games with different genres. Of course, provided that there is a monetization of them and there is some kind of winnings as offered, and would like to harness the use of social networks in order to increase and make more varied the offering that they have. So as a result, you'll see that there is a convergence from the casual games on one hand and also traditional games of chance of casino on the other hand. You will see that the spectrum becomes rather a continuum, and sometimes it's very difficult to distinguish what is a casual game, what is a social game, and which games has to be traditional casino games. And why is it important? Because if we look from the side of casual social games only, we will see that there is no sectoral or what we call vertical regulation of the games on one hand. However, on the other hand, there is very strict regulatory oversight on all games of chance, at least in the European Union. So when we talk about the vertical regulation of this sector of games of chance, we'll see that within the European Union, even though there is the concept of the single market, there is an absence of any sectoral regulation, any vertical regulation of the games of chance. So the law has been actually developed by many decisions of the European Court of Justice. So from the last 20 years of experience that European Court of Justice had with this, with the games of chance, these are the basically outcomes of what the current situation and current situation within the EU is. First of all, there is a realization that gambling is an economic activity and it has to be treated as such. However, it is a very special economic activity, and because of the speciality of this economic activity, there is an exception from the general principle of EU that any operator, any provider of service or goods has the right and the freedom to provide its services across border. So the principle is if you are established in one member state, then you don't need any special authorization, any additional sanction or any additional license in order to be able to offer your services across Europe throughout the whole of European Union. However, this does not apply to gambling activities. And because of that, the European Court of Justice decided that every country has the right to use its own approach to regulating gambling. Now, we will see that the approaches are very different, but every approach is good as long as it complies with the general principles of the European Union law. And the principles which are important in this particular discussion is that if there is a licensing, for example, in any member state, that has to be done without discrimination. The requirements that the operators have to be compliant with should be proportional, and they should be proportional to the aims that the regulator wants to achieve. And as far as the aims themselves are concerned, we can see that there can be public policy within the country, which can be different and differs from one country to another. It can be even regulation of the games in order to reduce its negative element on the population of the country. It has to be protection of minors, protection of vulnerable persons, and also to ensure that there is no criminal element that going into the industry, and also with regard to the players and money going through the industry. Well, as far as we just mentioned that there are different approaches that countries have within the European Union for regulation of gambling. Now, there is a whole spectrum of different approaches. It ranges from recognition of foreign licenses. This, for example, is the situation currently in the United Kingdom. If you have a license, say, in Malta, which is a hub for gaming and gaming licensing these days, then on the basis of this license, you can offer your services, you can market your operations to UK customers. You don't need any other license because according to the laws of Great Britain, if you have a license within EU, no matter what country it is, and it is sufficiently detailed and provides certain protections to the players, that's enough for you to be able to offer the services to UK citizens and to market and promote and advertise your services there. On the other hand, there are many other countries, and importantly, I would like to mention Norway here, which is part of EEA, even though not part of the EU, that basically prohibits a lot of things, but for things that it doesn't prohibit, it has a monopoly. There is, I think it's the only country within Europe that doesn't have a single casino. It just offers lotteries, and it's generally monopolized. And so this is another approach that a European country has decided. Nothing to almost all gambling's prohibited, but there is a monopoly for certain activity only. Then there are national licenses, and this is a very growing trend. Up to 2007, 2008, there was basically no other countries within the EU apart from UK and Malta that had national licenses. But at some point, and it was Italy, who was going through a huge recession like pretty much everybody else, that they realized that it's a good way to make extra money for the government. And so they decided to legalize the service and offer it under the national licenses. And this trend has progressed, and there are quite a few European countries these days that require national license in order to provide services to citizens of that country. After Italy, there was Denmark, then there is France, Spain, Ireland and the Netherlands, for example, already introduced proposals to do something similar. And so the trend within Europe seems to be moving towards fragmented regulation of the market. As I mentioned, there is no regulation on the European level, and so it moves country by country. There is also a gray zone, which means it's neither allowed nor prohibited. So usually, excuse me, business there just goes without any regulation or without licensing, but number of countries within Europe in this gray zone generally diminishes. Or there is a complete prohibition of gambling. This is also possible. Now, when we look at this, we see that basically there are two different realities. And two different realities are there because if you look at online market for games of chance, it is basically a global market because it's a borderless market. You do it over mobile or you do it over internet. However, it is in great contrast with the national fragmented regulation because, as we said, you have to go and you have to comply with every country's license. And even though there are general principles that we'll discuss a bit later on that apply to all these countries' regulations, very often if you go into the regulated market, you will see that the devil is in the detail. And even though the principle is the same, you will have to twist your systems, you will have to adjust your game offering or the compliance requirements in a way that you comply with a multitude of different fragmented regulation, which obviously makes your business more complicated and more costly. So the bottom line is that there is no really juridical legal definition of a casual game and social game. There are plenty of other definitions. The Casual Game Association has its own definition, which is a very good one, but at law there is no definition of the casual game. So if you have a game offering, then you will need to ask yourself a question. Is it a casual game, social game, or is it a game of chance? Now, the difference with the outcome and with your answer will be that if it is non-casual, games of chance, then you basically don't need to worry about all this regulation. You can offer it without problems, even in the countries when the games of chance are completely prohibited. However, if the answer to the question will be that it's a game of chance, then you have to face and make sure that you are compliant, unless you want to run away really far. You have to make sure that you're compliant with all these obligations that imposed by local regulations. And since I said there is no juridical definition of games of skill or casual games, then let's look at the definition of the game of chance to see how to apply it to the games that you offer. So very often, if you look at legislation in different countries, they don't really have a generic definition, but very often they pinpoint a particular type of the game and they define the game itself, whether it's a lottery, whether it's a scratch card, poker, slot game, or bingo, or whatever. And they will describe what the game is very often, instead of just saying gambling and so and so. Now, the result is that you have to look into main components of the game, because there is a variety of the game, but you have to see what main elements of the games are. And if you look very closely, you see that basically there are three main elements. There is a stake, there is a chance, and there is a prize. However, if you compare these three elements with what we have present in the casual games, you can see that there is a lot of overlap, so to speak. If we start from the least important actually element here, which is a chance, you see that in order to be considered as a game of chance in many countries in Europe, it doesn't have to be 100% of chance. Of course, if you take a lottery, it's completely random event, and the next draw result does not depend on the result of the previous draw. The same with a roulette spin, and the same with pretty much other games. However, if you look at the game of poker, for example, which used to be called as a game of skill, or a lot of professional players who would like to present this game as the game of skill, you will see that in many countries in Europe, it is not considered as a game of skill at all. It is considered as a game of chance. Why is that? The bottom line is that if you have a random number generator that you use for something, maybe not for everything, maybe not completely to determine the outcome of the game, but at least if you use it for certain things, then most probably the game will be considered as having a chance element and therefore considered to be a game of chance. In poker, for example, of course, there is a shuffle of the cards. Even though there is skill of the players that is used, bluffing skills and everything else, but as long as there is the shuffle of the cards, therefore there is an element of chance, and therefore the game is considered as a game of chance. And it is regulated explicitly in Italy, in Denmark, in France, considered to be as a lesser kind of game of chance, but still regulated. About the stake, this seems to be a bit different because in the games of chance there must be a stake, and generally the stake is there in order to buy the ability to win something, the chance to win something. However, if there is any payment for the game, for a casual game, being to enter to the game, being at a subscription, or being for buying a virtual good within the game, it can still be considered as being payment of the game. For example, there was a recent discussion in the United Kingdom about promotional games. When you just call, you call and you say an answer to a quiz or something like that. And quiz, you would say it's obviously not a game of chance. However, it was considered that from the point of view of the stake, the money that you pay to call is considered to be a payment into the game. Even though it is often possible to actually refund this money, nevertheless, it was considered that this is a stake. And the winning in the game, we have to remember that winning does not need to be money. If you have only virtual currency that you cannot exchange into anything, then probably it will not be considered to be a winning. If you, on the other hand, have a virtual currency or virtual good that you can trade, and at some point, even not in one step, but in many steps, you can convert into real money, then most probably it will be considered as the winning. And so basically, the two, if you can win a game and you have the toy and you can exchange it, it will be considered to be a winning. The most important elements here are the stake and the winning. And therefore, you can see from here that many games that are considered to be casual games would, under the certain circumstances, considered to be games of chance. Now, if this happens, what do? You have to see what are the main principles of regulation of the games of chance. And there are quite a few, and I will discuss a few of them. Basically, the most important one is the protection of the players. The game should be fair. The money that the player deposits with the operator should be safeguarded. No underage player should be allowed, and there has to be important elements present within the game offered by the operator to make sure that if there is a possibility of addiction to the game, then it is dealt with. And from the point of view of restricting or not allowing rather criminal elements within the game, this usually is dealt from two different aspects. One, the operators, before they're getting licensed, they're checked. There will be due diligence performed on them on one hand, and on the other hand, there are obligations imposed on the providers in order to make sure that there is no money laundering going on within the game. And something we will not discuss in detail, but you have to remember that once you become a licensed operator, once you become in this space, there will be a lot of extra taxes to pay. Because one of the reasons why there is a regulation of the space is for the government generally to extract a little bit more as taxes are concerned, and sometimes use them for good causes. So let's just go into very few of them. The fairness of the game. Well, this is a joke that I really like. When you see the randomness of the random number generator, and you say, well, this is the random number, 999999. And the question is it really random? And it's a perfect answer. Well, that's the problem. You can never be sure whether it will be the same or not. So in order to be sure that the answer of the game is random, generally the random number generator has to be certified, and generally it has to be done by an independent accredited lab, like JLI, for example. Very often it can cost a lot of money, so this is another expense that the regulated business has to go through. There are obviously certain tests that can be used, but generally you cannot certify your random number generator yourself. You have to use an independent lab. If you use if you offer games which are player-to-player games, then you'll have to make sure that you have anti-collusion mechanisms. For example, for poker, it's very important that you have anti-collusion means and tools, because obviously you can rig the game very easily if you have two players, for example, sitting in the same room with two different screens and being in the same table. They can obviously collude with each other and completely change the outcome of the game. So your system will have to implement, these features, And very important, often in many countries there is a prohibition of using of the bots, because obviously they will have different abilities to human beings. The gambling addiction is a very important part of regulation of the business. And this is regulated by forcing the operator to put certain limits and to make sure that the limits are always available for the players. The first kind of limits is the limit how long the player has to stay within the game. In many regulations, you will have to make pop-ups that say every hour pop up and say, do you know that you've been playing for an hour? Are you sure you want to play? Of course, operators are not happy with it because it distracts the player from the game. But the regulators, in order to make sure that the players are there in reality and don't get carried away, you usually have to implement this. Another limit that you will be forced to implement is to make sure that there is a limit for the level of the stakes and for the losses that you as a player can take within a particular period of time. For example, $100 in a month or $50 in a week or whatever. And the last important feature is self-exclusion. A player should be able to, ideally automatically by self-service, to exclude himself from being able to play a game on your site. And it sounds ridiculous because you want the player to play, but this is a feature that generally is required by all regulated markets. And the operator is prohibited from accepting the stake or allowing the player to play within this self-exclusion period. Protection of the minors, it's important, and it's important that you have tools and mechanisms in order to disallow minors to enter the game. And in most countries, it's under 18, but in some countries, it can be 21 or some other age, so you have to make sure that you adapt your system for this. It's also important and compulsory always to register your players before you allow them to play for real money. And that involves also accepting certain documents and requiring know your client's information from the client. Again, very often it's a nuisance for both operators and the players, but it's generally important to implement. The anti-money laundering provisions are very strict, and all real money gambling operators are generally subject to it. Right now in Europe there is a third anti-money laundering directive which only puts casinos, even online casinos, as part of the subject person that should be compliant with the law. But there will be very soon, next year, fourth anti-money laundering directive, and it will require all operators, not just casinos, poker operators, sports bookmakers, and so on and so forth, to be subject to this legislation. Therefore, you have to have archives of all the financial transactions, of all games that you play, and you have to put the KYC from your players, especially at the point that they withdraw money. There are some other requirements that you will have to be aware of. For example, the money that you hold on behalf of the player have to be ring-fenced, which means you have to put them in a separate bank account and you cannot use them. It would be great if you can use them for your marketing campaigns, but the law prohibits that from being done, and you have to put them separately in case you go bust. You have to ensure that the player's money are safeguarded. And there are lots of other restrictions. So what can we draw? What can we draw from this general introduction? Basically, first of all, the regulation is very expensive. It is expensive not in terms of getting the license, it's also expensive from the point of view of compliance, ongoing compliance, especially because of the fragmentation of the regulation within European Union. You'll have to make sure that you have compliant with all different countries. Now, there is a trend to increase the sphere of regulation and slowly add to the regulatory requirements also games of skill, as long as there is a stake and there is the price. So I would not be surprised if I will see very soon UK, that is already discussing it, regulating games of skill with price. Of course, that also means that the current gambling operators who are already in the space, they will be much better off in grasping this reality and complying with these requirements because they're already there. They already invested in this regulation, while for social companies from social space moving into the game, it will be much more difficult to do. However, since the gambling operators want new different games, I would say that there will be lots of partners forming that we already have seen in order to allow different new content for gambling operators and also allow the social game providers to enter into the space. Well, from the game developer's point of view, it's always important to know what the regulation is about, because ultimately you will have to implement all the features in your systems. Thank you for your attention. Any questions?
Yes, I would like to know in either context about the regulation of children. In casual games, I understand children to be regulated sometimes down to the age of 13, and I've had a hard time in drafting end-user license agreements to be effective. Do you have any advice?
Well, to make sure that your terms and conditions when the player signs are effective, the most sure way is basically to have the legal guardian or a parent of a child to sign. Because in many countries, the agreement with a minor is simply not valid, whether you like it or not. The child can still have a means of payment for the game, but the bottom line that if you want to enforce the agreement, most probably you will not be able to do so, unless you have the legal guardian or a parent actually signing for it. So ideally, even though in practice, of course, it's difficult sometimes to do, but this is the only sure way of doing it, to have the over 18, the legal guardian of the person to sign.
Hi. Today, a lot of companies avoid local laws by moving their online services to another countries with soft laws or lower taxes. Is it possible to regulate when, for example, company and site is registered and located in USA, for example, and they make site for online gambling, for example, and position it and market for it for Norway, where you say it is all prohibited? Is there any way for Norway to control and enforce it somehow?
Okay, Norway is a very good example, because Norway implemented blocking of financial transactions on gambling back in 2010. As you know, each kind of business has its own unique code. So for gambling, it is 7995 code. And therefore, it's very easy to see what transaction is for gambling and what not. And so Norway decided to block all the financial transactions with this code as from 2010. I attended a talk of the Norwegian regulator some time ago, and he said, "We are so happy, it's working. There is no one on offering any services on Norway." And the operators who are making huge profits from Norway were just laughing in the face of the regulator. So the question is, yes, it is possible. It is not 100% possible, but it is possible in many different ways. Rule number one, that all legislation is national, and therefore the competence of all the laws is within the borders of the country. This is exactly the reason why normally you would move, or you would try to move, most of your physical location, your servers, your people, and so on and so forth, abroad. If we're talking about Norway, I would say it's enough to move it in another European country, because I haven't seen any attempts from Norway to actually enforce this prohibition. But I wouldn't really put it in US, because US is a totally different cup of tea, and they will go to the moon in order to get persons. So EU is fine, Curacao is fine, Costa Rica is fine, but probably not US. If the regulator really want to enforce this, it is possible, but it will be extremely difficult. In Malta, where I'm based, there was an attempt of the French monopoly a few days ago, PMU, to enforce a ban on provision of the services, both against the B2C operator and also against the data center, the ISP and the data center, and they failed. Because the rules were such that even though they won the case in France, they presented the enforcement of a huge fine in Malta within the EU. But the court in Malta said, well, this is not an offense in our country, so why exactly do we need to do so? So it is very difficult to enforce so. So my advice would be try to move it in a country, ideally when there is no extradition treaty between your target market and your place. This is the ideal situation. So probably Argentina is the best space for absolutely everyone, because it doesn't have extradition treaties with anyone. But very often, the countries will not try to do that, because they know it's extremely difficult, and because they would normally enforce administrative fines. And even within the European Union, there is no way to enforce administrative fines in an easy form. There are criminal fines that are easily enforced. There are taxes that can be enforced across the border, but not administrative fines. Thank you very much.
Thank you.